My name is Clay Williams, and this is People Talks, presented by Canal Pursuit Productions. The idea behind People Talks is that everyone has a story, and everyone's story has value. People Talks is a mix of people with lived experience and people working in fitness and mental health fields. This week's guest is Chuck Leblanc. Chuck is a registered psychotherapist with a master's degree in philosophy and a master's degree in counselling psychology. He's the host of Couch to Couch, Making Therapy Make Sense with Chuck Leblanc, and co-host of Men Tell Stories, both of which can be found on Spotify. As a therapist, he provides individual counseling with a special interest in working with men and adolescents who experience anxiety, social awkwardness, anger issues, and depression, who are sick of being held back by stress, who want to stop bottling up their emotions and be more present so they can better enjoy their lives. As a philosopher, he's interested in growth and capability development, and his research and interest in existentialism, postmodern thought, and phenomenology, as well as his research in Amartya Sen's capability approach to development, largely inform his counseling practice. With that, welcome to People Talks.
Thank you for having me on, Clay. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
I'm glad we were able to connect. I spoke with Megan Cumming, who you're connected to, and she mentioned your name and suggested we get in touch. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Where did you come from? What has led you to where you are right now? And that could be a really long thing or a really short thing, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that it's a pretty giant question, actually. Because it weaves into how I ended up with a master's of philosophy all the way to psychology. So essentially, if we can walk down memory lane to when I was a young kid. So as a kid, I was a severely bullied kid for about 17 years of my life. By the time I was 13, I was extremely depressed and anxious and very socially awkward. And by age of 13, about there is when I had contemplated suicide for the first time. So this is when I had to deal with suicidal ideation and a plan. And I had an event take place that, although seemed very innocuous and kind of silly, did change the course of my life in this little moment. So I had met someone who was extraordinary, and although no one knew the struggles that I was going through because I was very good at hiding it, that goes a long way in trauma responses when it comes to someone who's bullied as severely as I was. Just the act of meeting this person caused me to start questioning why do I no longer feel like I want to kill myself, basically. After meeting them. It was just a very simple thing, but it's something that I wrestled with for most of my high school life, all the way until I entered university, trying to figure out what happened and what changed. And, in my adolescent mind, as you see in the movies, it was like, oh, I fell in love. It's a beautiful woman, right? Like an angel descended from the heavens, as I always joke.
And saved you.
That's right. Yeah. Saved me, right? As we, kind of those romantic stories we write. Mm-hmm. But the truth of it was, in the level of despair that I was in at the time, where, when you're dealing with depression to that degree, you're kind of wallowing in like a lake of despair. So hope is not present. And I had met someone who looked at me in a certain way that it was like I mattered. It was like there's something about the way they were looking at me, like I was the only person in the room. And for a long time, outside of my home life, because my home life was pretty great, my parents were pretty great, but my social life was horrid, I had never experienced that. Or didn't know what that was like. So it was almost like something I talk about on my podcast and in my therapy a lot. It was like a shock to the system, which led me to university. So when I was 21, so up until the point of going to school, I thought that I would just drift through life. Basically, I was in Algonquin College for maybe 3 months, and then I failed out of school, and I went to work at my old job, which I loved at the time. I was a warehouse worker at Winners. And then I had met someone who convinced me to go to school. And they convinced me to go to university, and I assumed, I basically applied to university on a bet. And I assumed that I wasn't going to make it for very long in university, but I accidentally tripped and found my way into a philosophy course. And in this particular course, it was my very first course. I'll never forget it. It was Tuesday morning at 8:30. And there was a professor named Dr. Nievold, who's quite good friends with me now, who I followed all the way through my master's experience. There was something about the way he taught a complicated thing like philosophy. Because as you said, I was actually laughing when you were saying you didn't know what philosophy was or how that even works, because neither did I. When I signed up for my university courses, my girlfriend at the time signed up for me because I didn't know what any of these things meant. So I was like, you fill it out and we'll just kind of go from there. And so when I showed up for philosophy class, I was kind of amazed because the individual was almost like a stand-up comedian, incredibly passionate and like hilarious, talking about some wacky things like the principles of the universe as seen through the ancient Greek thought. And I remember thinking to myself, first, who the hell thinks of this stuff? And second, why is it so exciting? And this helped me get really into my studies. So before I entered university, I was very near, I wouldn't say a high school dropout, but I very nearly failed. So it was like my grades were no higher than maybe a 50, 55 throughout. I was not interested in school. I'm someone with ADHD, so I struggled with education for most of my life. But then this one class kind of did it for me, and I became obsessed with trying to understand how it worked. And this kind of followed my experience when I was 13, because I ended up in one of my second classes learning about Dante's Divine Comedy, as everyone knows, which talks about love and the will and intellect and all these fun things about how humans experience life. And that really started the process of me thinking about, not only what does it mean to be human, but what does it mean to live a good life? What is happiness? How does happiness work? Why is it so difficult? Is happiness just somebody who feels joy 100% of the time, or is that left for people or in the movies? Like, how does this even work? And that eventually led me to my master's, where I read Amartya Sen's capability approach. And what I learned in my master's of philosophy was that happiness isn't like smiling all the time, right, and feeling content 100% of the time. Happiness comes from the root word eudaimonia, which simply means flourishing. And flourishing means it's that feeling you get when you're pursuing the things that you value. So you were talking about running earlier. So it's clear, I mean, if you're an ultra marathon, you have to love running, right? It has to be a part of of who you are. And as you know, when you're pursuing running, there are days when you don't want to run, right? There's days where the body hurts, where you're angry, where you're frustrated, where you're super hot, like hyper, where you're like, yeah, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened, right? Flourishing means to be fully entrenched in something that you're enjoying, but it doesn't mean that you're happy all the time. So that carried me through to become a life coach. So after that, I became a life coach because I wanted to start helping people pursue the things they had reason to value. And in the midst of all of that, I started to get really interested. So I was brought back after an experience at the end of my master's where my best friend at the time passed away from suicide. And it drugged me right back into how I was feeling when I was 13, which was a shock. And I was stuck in my dorm room for 2 months. I did nothing but work, missed out on a lot of classes. I was lethargic. Just the world seemed very gray. And because of my background, I started to realize that if I didn't move, if I didn't get up and do something, I'm going to be right back to where I was when I was 13. The life would have been sucked right out of me. And so I left my dorm room that day and I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to take the first opportunities that show up. And I rounded a corner and I met Dr. Nievold, who was teaching at the school I was doing my master's. And he said, do you want to go to India? I'll never forget this. He said, do you want to go to India to help the undergrads? Because they were sending undergrads to India to work with an NGO. And they wanted someone to go there to guide like the philosophy side of it. And I said, no, but I will. And so I went. And it was there that I started to realize that there was a whole other side of things to human happiness than just, pursuing the things you had to value. There was emotions involved. There was mental health. There was psychology involved. And that's really what led me into becoming a counselor. So I drifted for a while and researched for a while until I went to school and became a psychologist or a psychotherapist. So that was both the long and short story.
That's it's been quite a journey.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you've made it so far.
Thanks.
So you're and what are you doing now? So explain your connection to Megan and the Kemptville Stress Relief Center.
So I knew that the area of mental health that I wanted to work in was men's mental health, and that was directly related to my own personal experiences as a man and navigating these complex emotions, such as grief. Grief is a big thing for me, where I have a difficulty expressing it. And so I knew I wanted to do male mental health and work in that field because it was very important to me. And so when I was researching where I wanted to do my practicum, I knew that I wanted to do my practicum in Kemptville because earlier on, a couple of years earlier, before I was deciding this, I had lived in Osgood with my parents for a while as I was deciding for next steps, and I spent a lot of time in Kemptville. There was a gym there, Anytime Fitness, and the downtown Kemptville's beautiful, so I came in and out of it. And I always said, well, eventually this is kind of the area that I want to end up later on. And so when I was doing my practicum, I started to research, what was in Kemptville. Are there any male mental health specialists in Kemptville? In rural communities, it's extremely needed. Like, it's a big thing to have. And at the time, there wasn't very many, if at all. And so as I was looking for places to work, the Kemptville Stress Relief Center is what stood out to me. And Megan and I have differing backgrounds, but similar beliefs in a lot of the stuff that we do. And so I was really excited to have that conversation. The first interview we ever had, we kind of got right into it. It wasn't your typical interview because we had very similar thoughts to things. And I wanted to work with Megan specifically. So she was my supervisor when I became my practicum. Because, as I mentioned before, I'm like philosophy based, right? So a lot of the ways I talk about things is I'm very emotive. The emotions are very interesting to me. And also the intellect is very interesting to me. But up until I worked with Megan, I didn't really understand the connection to the physical side of things, the body. So what they would call the somatic experience. And so I wanted to work with her specifically because I needed to understand that side. So a pursuit based on curiosity and need in Kemptville. And one of the reasons I stayed on after is because I found exactly what I was looking for.
There's a lot of curiosity in your history.
Yes, that I would say, to boiling myself down to my base elements, it's curiosity is my top thing.
I have to admit, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What is phenomenology?
Yes. So phenomenology, I know that was such a silly thing to write in there without explaining it. So phenomenology is the study of how we get to know something personally. So it starts from perception. So what is my personal experience of, so subjective experience is another way to put it. What's my subjective experience of the situation or the thing that's happening? There's a philosopher named Maurice Merleau-Ponty that I draw a lot from, who talks a lot about how the human being, as an embodied being, E-M-B-O-D-Y, we experience things fully. So in our society, we tend to divide things between the mind and the body. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the way he talks is that's kind of a artificial division, but they both inform each other just as we human beings inform the environment. So here's a really big instance. One way to explain phenomenology really easily is if we look at this cup, this teacup. Well, your experience of the teacup and my experience are going to be different because you're seeing one side, I'm seeing the other side. Nevertheless, it's a full, complete teacup. But perhaps when you were younger, you had a different experience with teacups. Maybe you had a grandmother who collected them and loved them. So when you see the teacup, you might accidentally, almost on instinct, think, oh, she would have loved this because of, this color or this shape, or it has this words on it. But that experience and that nostalgia would be absent from me. Mm-hmm. And so this real life thing, a teacup, is going to have two different definitions and feelings to two different people depending on your history. So depending on your perception of the event or the object. So phenomenology is the study of that.
Okay.
So when you're thinking about that in mental health terms, if you look at something like anxiety, so I mentioned before that I was severely bullied growing up. So people, although I'm extroverted, people can seem dangerous to me at first glance. So I'm always going to have an instinctual response of like nerves where I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen here. And most people would have that. But for me, it's informed by my history. Mm-hmm. So I've had actual events where people were in fact dangerous, but not all people are dangerous. So that's part of my perceptual awareness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things you mentioned when you talking about Megan and getting to know the work that she does is the mind-body connection. Yeah. So what's your experience with that? What's your approach with that? The mind-body connection as opposed to the separate mental health field and physical health field.
Well, I think that I think when we look at the connections between, I think it's very dangerous to disconnect both. It's so just a little quirky history lesson in case you ever go to a trivia night at a pub. We only started separating this connection with Descartes back in like 300 years ago when he talked about what's called cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And so what he decided was that the only thing we know for sure is that we think. So it all starts in the mind. Everything else is constructed. Science took that and ran with it. And then created what I always call like disembodied heads, in which I was one of them for a long time, thinking, mind over matter, cognition comes first. But the truth of it, and we find this with athletes, I do like bodybuilding and powerlifting, and I'm quite deep into the physical world, that side of the athletics. What you find is that they're both activated at the same time. They're intertwined. So for instance, let's talk about anxiety again. So the thoughts that I'm having when I start to get anxious are being fueled by an amygdala response, which is a survival response, right? Which essentially boiled down is a nervous system response. So the words that are showing up and the way that I'm seeing things is being informed by the chemicals floating through my brain and the attachment to certain histories and nostalgic points, all at the same time. The tools I'm using to defend myself, whether it's like avoidance, procrastination, fight, flight, whatever it is, comes from repeated habits and practices from when I was younger of safety mechanisms that worked and worked really well back then. And so these are all, at no point can you separate one from the other, right? And any athlete, you know this from running, and I would know this from, working out or lifting really a PR, let's say, doing a heavy deadlift or running a marathon. At some point, one or the other starts to fail. And you can call on the words from the body or the words from the mind, and they'll kind of work together. So if your body's starting to fail, then you can use a Kickstarter from the brain to get it going. If the mind's starting to fail, as it always does, the mind's usually the first one to go, as your body's like, come on, we can keep going. And the brain's like, I'm going to die, right?
Yeah.
Then you can start to play games with yourself, and the body will respond. Or you can take a deep breath, or you can psych yourself up. And so these are ways to pump adrenaline through, get, oxygen flowing. Or when you're dealing with like a heavy lift, if your mind has given up, but you reach past a certain point on the lift, then you can keep going. So then the mind will be like, oh, wait a minute, let's go, right? And so they're always interrelated. But, another example of this is if you're dealing with someone who has ADHD like myself. So I'm very hyperactive, as you can probably tell at this point, especially when I get passionate. Well, working out has always been a pretty phenomenal outlet for that energy. So when I'm, as a therapist, I take like a lot of clients throughout the day, and I have breaks set up so that if I get really amped, I can run downstairs to my gym in the basement and do a full workout. And then by the time I come back, I'm regulated. I can focus again. And so all of these things are intertwined.
So you look pretty young. You're probably not too long out of university. I'm thinking about mental health care and physical health care. So there's a hospital with the blue H on the roof, and that's where people go when they have a broken leg or to get their cancer surgery and that sort of thing. And there's the mental health facility. That's a separate place, a separate way of dealing with that. But I think we've seen probably in the last 10 years, certainly more in the last 5 years, recognition by the leaders or whoever it is that makes policy decisions, that there's connections there that need to be made. Are you seeing that as well, or are you part of that system? Or is the Kemptville Stress Relief Center kind of part of Kemptville's wellness organization?
Well, I would say we're part of like wellness,
right?
In the area. It's a stress relief center, so it's a wellness center, right? When you're looking for psychological or psychotherapeutic services, it's because something isn't working in your life.
Right.
Right? If you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling depressed, there's something about the tools you're using that aren't working anymore. Simple as that, right? It's not a case that something's broken. It's more a case of the tools that we use to protect ourselves in whatever ways are not efficient anymore. And I know I was talking a little bit about that I always go back to that social awkwardness piece or social anxiousness piece for me. When I was younger, it was very efficient for me to avoid people because it was actually the case in my environment that they were, more often than not, I was going to get bullied, physically abused, something by the people around my school. And so I avoided like the plague. So when I'd enter a party, I'd have to stand outside the party for 15 minutes, take a couple of breaths before I could ever walk in, even if they were friends I was walking into. But later on in life, that was very different. Very different, especially now, right? And so I'm 38, and so in my life now, it's very rare that someone tries to bully or do something with me. And so, but the other fact is I'm an extrovert. I love people. So you can imagine how confusing that was in my early days, right? But I had to go through a period of time where I had to pay close attention to the frustration and the discomfort that I was having around being anxious around people. And that frustration and that discomfort is indications from your body that, okay, this tool isn't, the software needs an update is something I always say, right?
Yeah,
so it's not...
Either the problem has not the problem, the environment or something has changed that all the pieces don't fit together properly anymore, right?
Exactly, because these tools that you're using to defend yourself, they only work until they don't. And most of the time they don't work anymore, not because something worse has entered your environment, although sometimes that can happen, but you've grown into the type of person. So I know that I became a type of person where I was not bullied anymore. I was much more assertive. I didn't create the conditions where that could happen, and I wasn't in the environment that invited those people in. And so I remember the last time it happened to me, I was at the university I had worked at before I became a therapist, a Christmas party, and I knew everybody in the Christmas party. And I walked up and I did the same thing I've done since I was 16 years old. I stood outside and sweated. With nervous stomach, I felt like I was going to vomit. Like all these things were happening, and I was like, "Whoa, everybody in there. It's okay. This is not the same thing." And then I was able to take a deep breath and walk in, and kind of start to teach myself through different habits and practices that this is an old tool. So now I have to create new tools, and through therapy, through working with someone, I was able to create new tools that better suits how I go about this. But those are the kind of things people are facing, whether it's depression, anxiety, ADHD treatment is very similar. It's just new tools. And it's also being able to create an environment where people can walk in, talk about the struggles they're having, and have that being heard. Right? I've never heard anything in a therapy session that I thought was weird. Right? Something Megan always says, and I would agree, is I've never met a crazy person in a therapy session, right? Just people trying to live the best they can. So I think that's a large part of wellness, because that ties into, whether it's physical or mental wellness, it ties into what I was mentioning in the beginning about flourishing, right? Part of happiness is pursuing the things you have reason to value. But part of that is being able to develop the capabilities to pursue the things you have reason to value. When something is getting in the way of those capabilities, and this is the heart of the capability approach, is being able to see what capabilities are you restricted from? Do you not have access to right now that's blocking you from going in the direction you want to go? Where are those barriers present? Because if we can lift those barriers, then you can find those capabilities and those opportunities to pursue it. Because you definitely have something you're looking to pursue, whether it's happy marriage, better job, whatever it is. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I definitely I went for
yeah,
it.
definitely. It went down a little rabbit hole, but that's okay. You were talking about tools and an interesting approach to thinking about our actions, what a lot of people would consider our reactions to situations as tools. There's great value in understanding that our reactions or our reactive thoughts or our habits or nervous habits, let's say, are tools, and those are bits of the thing that makes us up. And yeah, that's kind of neat that we can look at those and understand that yeah, this one's not working anymore. This isn't effective anymore. Maybe I can change this tool a little bit, or just get rid of this tool and not need it at all anymore. But taking a look at our some of the components of our life and understanding what they are and that they can be changed, right?
That's right. And one of the way I explain these things, which is a lot, which will tie into kind of your background with the physical side, is in terms of learning a maneuver, right? So every sport has a specific way the body needs to move. And we call those techniques, we call those movements. And some of them are not natural in the sense that we don't learn them when we're a kid. So we have to learn how to efficiently move our bodies. And I always relate this back to bench pressing, just because I did powerlifting and bodybuilding. And I'm sure this comes up in running as well, where, you bench press, the body does a different thing when you're trying to bodybuild than when you're powerlifting. And a lot of it has to do with the arch of your back, right? So in a bodybuilding, you want a flat back, right? You're using your abdomen, but you're having a flat back to get more of a range of motion onto your chest. And a powerlifting is much different. You arch your back so that you can create a bridge that leads down to your feet through all your stabilizer muscles, like your abdomen and your obliques, to be able to lift a heavy weight appropriately. So it's two different things because you're doing two different things. So the way I explain it is, my avoidance tendencies, which I learned when I was younger, was similar to learning how to bodybuild, bench press like bodybuilding. It was the first tool I used, and it was the most efficient. So when I'm trying to learn how to powerlift, and I remember this specifically because it took me so long to figure out how to do it, I had to do repeated conscious action of arching my back properly, setting my shoulders properly, and then lifting. And even to this day, if I'm not watching myself properly, I can slide back into a flat back before I realize. And so these mental tools are exactly the same. So although I've gone through therapy and I'm very good at asserting myself and I really like people, there are certain instances where the old tool can show up. And the reason that's important to know is because these tools they're habits and practices that become reflexes. That's what your defenses are, the reflexes. They get the job done. It's kind of like, I'm not sure if you've ever met like boxers, but if you meet a champion boxer who hasn't, they've been out of the game for 20 years, they're in their 50s or 60s. If you throw a punch their way, they're going to dodge it. And they're not even going to know what they did, right? It's just part of the game for them. And so you have to practice these things over and over again until they become part of the system. So it's a lot like taking the old tool, so for me, the avoidance, and putting it on the back shelf. So in extreme circumstances, this is a good tool. In the immediate circumstances, it's no longer efficient. So one reason I'm bringing that up is not only does it tie to the mind-body situation, But it also is very important that you don't judge them, not judging the tools you're using because they're there for a reason. Saying they're good or bad tools is a lot more shame-based than saying they're efficient or inefficient.
So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, and we kind of touched on it before I hit the record button, is I think a lot of people don't know what a therapy session looks like or what a counseling session looks like. So I guess there's a couple of questions. One is, why would I make an appointment to see you? So what is a typical person that you would have a therapy session with, and what does a therapy session look like?
So this is my favorite question because I spend like 2 hours a week talking about this on a podcast. So,
So we're not going to take all of those weeks, are we?
well, whatever you want. As you can see, I'm kind of hyper and long-winded, so I can go for hours. So that's a really interesting question. So the type of people that come to see me are typically males. Although I do have some females, it's really just dependent. My niche is male mental health, but I'm not blocked at that.
Not exclusive?
Not exclusively males. That deal with anxiety, social awkwardness, ADHD, and depression. Now, that's a wide range of things to deal with because it does cover quite a bit. But essentially, it's people who are coming in who notice that, you know what, there's something going on in my life and it's not working. But I don't know what it is. I don't know. I know that I'm just like sad all the time, or I'm angry all the time, or I can't leave my house, I'm anxious. Like all these things are happening that are blocking me from pursuing things and limiting me. But I'm a bit lost as to what the hell to do about it, right? And so when someone walks into the therapy session, really the beginning point of a therapy session with me, and every therapist is a bit different. But for me, a lot of my training comes from two specific areas, and that would be person-centered therapy by Carl Rogers, and then narrative therapy is a big one for me. And essentially the idea behind both is really how my therapy sessions work. And what it starts with is the client that comes in is the expert in their own life. I'm not the expert in their own life because I haven't lived it, until they develop technology that can beam me into your head. Obviously, you're the expert in your own life. You know how you feel. And so my job is to walk alongside you as we uncover what's happening. So the very first session is a long conversation about that. It's about, the fact that you called in the first place. I have deep respect for you because that's not an easy thing to do right off the bat. So if this doesn't work within the first two sessions, if you're not getting the right vibe, it's not that you can't be helped, because that's pardon the language. I'm not sure if I can swear on the podcast, but that's a bullshit statement. It's more that the relationship, we're not jiving, right? And if I'm going to help you navigate this, then we have to jive. And so then by the second session, if it doesn't work, I'll help you find someone where it will, because I have a network and I've gotten to know you for 2 days. So I can help you better than you being on your own. But as a therapist, I'm very direct and open, because I'm dealing with, one of the blanket things that we talk about is I'm dealing with vulnerability, right? So a lot of the mental health issues that come up is from an inability to really express the emotions that you've got, whether it's from social upbringing or not. And so my job as a therapist is to be as open and honest as possible with you, so you don't have to guess what I'm thinking. And that's something that I'm very unique with. I know I've heard this quite a bit, but I don't like hiding things. And so throughout the session, we're going to start with exploring what's going on. What is your history with this particular issue that you're bringing in? And then we're going to talk about what's called psychoeducation. So part of having an equal partnership is a lot of what you and I have done today, is that I explain where I'm coming from. This is how I see the brain. This is the processes that are going on. What do you think? So that I can arm you with the same context that I'm seeing it. So I'm not one-upping you in any way. We're walking with the same understanding of what we're dealing with, and then we get to play with it. And then I'll build a map. Within the first two sessions, I build a map of how I'm seeing it. This is how I'm seeing it. This is what I think is going on. Here's a couple of hypotheses. These are the flavors I'm getting from the air. What do you think? Sometimes it's agreed upon. Sometimes the client's seeing something else. And if they're seeing something else, then we get to talk about it if they have a question, or if they don't, if they're like, no, you're full of crap. Let's go somewhere different. Then I'm like, great, let's take another look at it. And throughout the sessions going forward, it's really about being very empathic and congruent in that conversation to make sure that they understand in those 50 minutes that you spend with me, this is an environment where you're not going to be able to shock me. And I'm not going to shame or guilt you in any way, because the things you're bringing to me are just how you're encountering the world. So I have no right to be like, oh, that's a bad idea. Because who am I to say that? And we're going to deal with these emotions, because it always boils down to the emotions together. So part of being vulnerable as a therapist is that I'm going to feel the things that you're feeling while you're feeling them, if they impact me. So if we're in a conversation with grief, I'm going to cry along with you if that comes up, because we're together on it. And so a lot of this is about being vulnerable and open while being direct. And so it's a lot like unfolding, it's like cartography in a way, where we're building a map together, trying to find those points, trying to figure out where the compass is, trying to figure out what tools are being used, and then trying to navigate, okay, so we know where you're at, we know what led you here, we know what you're doing, and we know your history. Where do you want to go? From here, where do you want to go? And then we start to map that. Okay, so this is the goal. And if you can picture this in your mind, now you have a map, and then you have maybe a river we need to cross that we haven't really charted yet, and then we have the place they want to go. Our job is to cross the river. What do we need to do to cross that river?
Cool. I imagine that first session is has to be very amazing. So I'm thinking one of the tenets, I guess, of People Talks is that everyone's story has value. I think in my own experience, sharing the story of the death of my two brothers was what a kind of a turning point, right? There was this thing, it was always kind of in the background. We didn't talk about it. When I started talking about it, it became a thing that was out in the open. I definitely had to recognize it because I put a name to it, and people around me saw it as this event, not this shadowy thing that was in my background. So I think that first session of discovery of these things must be amazing. Just to be able to put a handle on those and recognize those reactions, those emotions for what they are, as opposed to this gray nebulous blah or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, because sometimes it's so overwhelming. It just feels like a blah, like a nebulous abyss. Especially if you're dealing with something as intense as like depression. Because you were talking about that, and I know with suicide. Depression. So, okay, let's take a step back to phenomenology again, because I know that you like that word now. I
like it.
Okay. So, basically, to tie in phenomenology to the story, to depression, our tools, our lenses, the way we see the world, the way we encounter the world, comes from the story that we're telling ourselves and the story that we've lived, right? And that story that's unfolding in front of us oftentimes can become quite rigid. And when you're in the midst of depression, if something happens, like a traumatic event, an upsetting event, something, basically to build your story and to see the world around you, you have what has been called, I think Mark Hennick calls it, a perceptual field. And whatever's in your perceptual field is relevant to you. That's what you pick out. And so the perceptual field is informed by things like your biology, your history, your social upbringing, the direct social environment that you're in, as well as your psychological environment. So how are you talking to yourself? What's the internal workings? Inform this perceptual field. And when things are going all right, that's a pretty wide field. You can see a lot of things. You can be available to see like surprising things, interesting things, exciting things. But when you're in the heat of depression, if you think of like, let's say you're running and you get a cramp, right? You get like a cramp in your side, which is, from what I've heard, is like one of the worst things that can happen. Once the cramp shows up, all you can think about is the cramp, right? Your perceptual field goes straight to the physical side of your body and it like hones in on it. Everything else be damned, right? You can't even, you probably, some people run into poles, right? When they're looking on their phone, the thing is so present for you. When you're in depression, same thing happens. That field shrinks because whatever's causing you pain is similar to the pain in your side. It's ever present. And, talking about phenomenology, the way you see the world is through the lens of this perceptual field. And if you're in the heat of depression, then you're seeing it from this very small perceptual field. And what's in those perceptual field is, and this talks a lot about the capability approach, is the lists of capabilities you can choose from to go about your day. And those get limited the more and more depressed you are, the more and more stuck you feel. And when you're dealing with something like suicide, what's happened is that perceptual field has shrunk to such a degree that there's limited choices. All you can think about is maybe it's ending suffering, maybe it's not being a burden on other people, but all of these things are very limited. And remember, in reality, there's a wide range of capabilities, but from the concept of perception, what you can actually see is very limited. And so when you're dealing with something like that, it can feel suffocating as that perceptual field gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And when you're dealing with male mental health, one of the reasons why, if you look at the statistics for suicide in Canada, completed suicide or death by suicide, the rates for men versus women is extremely high. So it's almost 3 times more. And part of that is because in our society, we don't teach men how to feel at all. Right. So our identities
we teach men how to do.
That's right. We teach them how to do, to provide, to fix. And there's nothing wrong with those roles, obviously. But it's limiting. So there's another, if you go back to the capabilities, it also limits the capabilities. If you think that grieving, for instance, being sad, being upset is weak, then you're going to have a limited amount of choices of how to get that out. So for me, I call it the glass box. So when I'm grieving, grief is one of the most difficult things for me to express. I always talk about climbing into my glass box and then I'm screaming for help, but nobody can hear me because I'm in a box. So now I'm avoiding, I'm being silent, I'm being shut out, right? So that perceptual field is now limited and nobody can hear me. And what I need to heal grief is I need to call someone in, right? I need to go through the process with someone, and I can't do that. I've cut myself off. And so with the idea of dealing with things like depression and suicide, with even anxieties like that, but the idea is that in therapy, what you're going to do is you're going to try to widen this field. And it always starts with trying to figure out what you're feeling. Because if it's restricted and you're male and you don't know that you're grieving, because sometimes you're so divorced from it, you don't know you're grieving. You're just pissed off at the world because we're allowed to be angry as men and frustrated. We're not allowed to be anything else. But we don't know why. And then when you get to the heart of it, and the minute you figure out it's grief, then the whole thing opens for you. And just being able to sit in a therapy room, or in the case of the pandemic, over the phone or through virtual, and have someone who actually cares, who's not going to judge you for it, who's not going to think anything other than respecting the story. Once we uncover that it's grief, well, there's nothing more healing than both people being impacted with that in that moment.
And powerlifting. Let's talk about powerlifting. So when I was in my 30s, I was a fairly serious, very amateur bodybuilder. So got all the muscle and fitness magazines and followed the bodybuilding world and all of that. And when you're talking about bodybuilding and powerlifting and the difference in form, that's definitely a thing. Sid Gravel, the retired police officer, is a powerlifter.
Oh, neat.
Now competitive too on a national level, as in a master's category, of course.
That's awesome.
But the mental aspect of when your mind says that your body's done. I have no more. I can't lift this anymore. I can't hold this anymore. I can't run this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Is kind of an interesting thing that has led me to ultra marathons. I ran my first 5K race in 2004, sorry, and it's the furthest I'd run in one stretch of running, right? And I didn't die. I knew I was tired at the end, but I thought maybe I could go longer. And it wasn't until I got to, I think, marathon distance that I really started to think this body thing is pretty amazing, and there's a connection here. There's our body tells our mind, I just want to sit down by that pole and have a nap. But our mind takes over, and there's lots left in the body, but all of our previous history tells us that we have to stop here. But if you push past that, there's lots more fuel in the tank, and you know that too, right? I mean, once you get to the place that that's the farthest you've ever been or the heaviest you've ever lifted, if you cross that boundary a couple of times, go past that boundary a couple of times, it kind of sets a precedent, or it can set a precedent that I can almost always get past this. Everything, right. There's a few times where my mind has just shut down and I'm done, really, I'm done. But I've always known in the back of my mind, you know what, there was probably a little bit more left in there. So that's kind of what pushed me to 100-mile races. I ran 750 kilometers in 2015 to see how far I could go before my body quit. And I found that after 4 or 5 days, it doesn't get any worse.
There you go.
doesn't get any better. But yeah, I think that's it's an interesting phenomenon, and I'm sure you feel that not just on your heaviest lift days, but on those on your workout days as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's all it's interesting because I was a powerlifter for a little while back in the day before I became a therapist, and now I'm back to bodybuilding. And if I would have a much different streak with powerlifting now if I got back into it, because I understand what's happening now than before, right? It's it's that conversation again that we kind of had with the amygdala response. You have the amygdala and your prefrontal cortex, and your prefrontal cortex only cares about like long-term consequences, goal planning, like all these things, creativity. And then your amygdala just cares about keeping you alive right now in the present. So when danger shows up and you hit what's called a red line, which means the fight-flight response has now shown up, it's going to do everything it can to get out of there, whatever the response is, right? And so when you're lifting, I forget what weight I was lifting, but it was a deadlift. And deadlift is my favorite exercise. And it was 300 plus pounds. And it was something that when I first started powerlifting, I said, like, if I make it here, that's it. That's amazing, right? Like
You've made it.
Yeah, because this weight is what I used to call stupid. It's just like still silly. And I think it was like 390 or something. I can't remember now, and I remember getting down to set up. I get the straps and I'm putting myself in the position. And even before I started lifting, my brain started to scream at me. You can't do this. You're an idiot. If you're going to break your back, like all these things showed up. And as I was arguing with myself, adrenaline was pumping. I now know that was an amygdala response to what I was about to do. And so if you think of it in terms of, this is why I like working with athletes, because it's a very common conversation, but it's a great way to get yourself to push yourself further, but also get to know your body better, is that the amygdala is going to use whatever it can to stop you from something it thinks is going to kill you. And it always, whether it's public speaking, powerlifting, or a gun, like walking on the war zone, it all thinks that you're going to die. That's it. And so when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking like, okay, well, all of these thoughts are coming through, and all I have to do at the time, so this is before I was a therapist, is like, if I just lift it, my brain will shut up, right? So you take a deep breath and you stand up, and I lifted it, and I went back down, and then I screamed, and there was celebration, it was all this crazy stuff. But now thinking back on it, it's interesting because the body knew there was more in the tank.
Mm-hmm.
The body knew I was capable of it. I mean, I've trained for months to be able to lift it. But the amygdala was afraid I was going to break my back and die,
Mm-hmm.
basically. And it believed it because it was an odd thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's it, right? There's a bit of fear there. And one of the things in my counseling sessions is I usually, for most clients, I'll recommend working out. Because not only is working out just good for mental health in general, for emotional regulation, but the body responds to movement. I mean, the human being is hardwired for stress. We adapt. If you,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, like how the body builds muscle is it stresses out the tissues,
Mm-hmm.
rips them, builds. So everything is hardwired to adapt. And so when you work out, the results of you working out are incredibly fast.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're someone who hasn't had a lot of success in their life, go to the gym.
Mm-hmm.
And you will get the feeling and an experience of success relatively quick if you stick with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can use that response and that stress test to the body back into whatever you're looking to do, get a new job, do whatever it is. So the gym is usually my go-to thing because your body will respond incredibly fast to routine. And
Mm-hmm.
changing habits in your mind is often very similar, routine and habit-based. It just feels different because we talk about them different. One way to put that, to go back to your story mode, just to solidify this point. In narrative therapy, we view when people come in with a problem, it's a very simple sentence that we see things as, and it's that the people aren't the problem is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what a concept, right?
Yeah.
But the way we talk about things in our society is that the people are the problem. And that kind of misunderstands entirely what's happening.
Right.
And when you're able to start to see it as externalized, like, wait a minute, no, I'm not the problem. The problem is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not people that are the enemy. It's that I've had the history of it and they make me uncomfortable. So I'm using tools that ensure my safety is a much different conversation than I hate people.
Right.
It's a much different conversation.
Yeah, I was just thinking of a barbell with 300 pounds on it and leaned over. When I was bodybuilding, the bench press, every time I got under the bar to do a bench press, I had this feeling of claustrophobia. And I every single time it was like this weight that was trying to crush me. I just had this funny feeling that so I understand now. Yeah, and I was always bodybuilding alone, so I never had a spotter. Maybe that made it worse.
It could. The amygdala will play tricks.
Yeah, I never got crushed to death by a bar, so
there you go.
I'm feeling all right. I think we've covered all the things I was kind of curious about, and lots more. I'm going to be listening to this like 2 or 3 times and picking out some of the little nuggets. I think we went all around the garden on this one. This is really good. I think you've got a really interesting background, a combination of philosophy and psychology. That's something I'm not familiar with. So I'm glad I was able to talk to you and explore some of that a little bit. It's a new territory for me. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad I was invited. This was a lot of fun. I know I said this to you in the pre-show, but it's always interesting being on the other side of the mic, and so it's fun. It's fun having these conversations, especially with someone you've never met, right? Because you can never know where they're going to go,
right?
Because it's such a wide scope to talk about that you can talk for hours and never quite get to the end of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that about does it. I'll say thank you very much, and I appreciate you spending time with me.
You're welcome, Clay. This was great.